Molt bé, doncs. Sí? Això, o se sent o això? Em sentiu? Molt bé, doncs donem inici a les ponències i taules d'aquesta jornada amb una ponència marc invitada del senyor Howard White, director general de Campbell Collaboration. Ja m'ha fet una mica de feina el senyor Cardona, o sigui que vull subratllar que Campbell Collaboration és una xarxa internacional dedicada a la producció i disseminació d'evidència i que té un lema, té un moto, una visió que apareix en els seus documents i al seu web que diu Better Evidence for a Better World. Evidentment, amb una institució que té aquest lema com a objectiu, doncs és una bona opció per encetar aquesta jornada. És a dir, necessitem millor evidència. Per què? Perquè volem millorar el món i millorar el món a través de les polítiques públiques en el nostre cas. El senyor Howard White va ser prèviament el director executiu i fundador de la Iniciativa Internacional per a l'Avaluació de l'Impacte, que s'escriu, i molts de vosaltres ho coneixereu com 3IE, les 3 Is i la E de l'avaluació. Una aliança que plega investigadors i decisors d'arreu del món amb l'objectiu comú de millorar la presa de decisions. A partir d'aquí va sorgir la Campbell Collaboration també. Va dirigir també el programa d'avaluació d'impacte del grup d'avaluació independent del Banc Mundial, abans del qual ell treballava com a acadèmic, va fer publicacions sobre l'eficàcia de l'ajuda, reducció de la pobresa, etc. i ha assessorat una àmplia gamma d'organismes internacionals de desenvolupament i treballat en molts països d'Àfrica i Àsia. Nosaltres estem molt contents d'acollir avui el senyor Howard White, que ens doni la ponència principal. Please, the floor is yours. I guess that this should work.
Yeah, I'm there. Okay, buenos dias. I'm very happy to be here and very glad I've been invited to speak to you all, and I'm very impressed to see such a large turnout to hear this topic and to hear about what's being done here in Catalonia to promote the cause of evidence. I'm going to speak about different approaches to evaluation, and particularly measuring results, and the different types of evidence you can use and how it's being used around the world, and the role of systematic reviews, which were briefly mentioned as being the type of studies that are supported by the Campbell collaboration. The whole point, and while we're here, okay, I had more slides than this. Maybe I'm going the wrong way. No? There we go. Okay, thank you. The whole point and why we are here is to make a difference. Why we do what we do every day when we go to work is not just because we want to earn a salary. We do it because actually we believe that the social and economic programs we work on can help those most in need, help the disadvantaged. And if we're not doing our work to make that succeed, then we're not doing our job properly. And over the last decade or so, there's been increased recognition of the role rigorous evidence can play in ensuring we truly make a difference. So if you're concerned about making a difference in your work, you have to take the agenda of evidence very seriously. The evidence agenda first arose in the School of New Public Management that has its origins in the UK and New Zealand and Australia, and later the US, back in the 80s and the 90s. So in the UK, it was first under the Conservatives of the Thatcher government, particularly the Major government, but it really took off being adopted by the Clinton governments and the Blair government. So Clinton from the early 90s and Blair from the late 90s. And I'll talk a little bit about the US experience in a moment. And one of the aspects of new public management was shifting from a focus on inputs to measure performance to measuring outcomes, like families lifted out of poverty, women empowered, children protected from abuse, and so on. So this shift in focus achieved in new public management was very important, because those of us who are old enough to remember, it really was the case in the 80s or indeed going into the 90s that many agencies measure their performance simply by the amount of money they spent, or the number of people they hired, or the number of vehicles they purchased. My own background is development, and so many development projects would indeed measure success by consultants hired, vehicles purchased, and so on, not by actually making a difference to preventing children dying prematurely, the things that matter. So the shift to outcomes was very important, a very important achievement from new public management, and that focus on outcomes is still there. However, the focus on outcomes took a wrong turn by focusing on outcome monitoring rather than actually understanding what it is to make a difference to what is achieving the outcomes we're seeing. So let's take an example from the United States, which was the earliest mover in new public management, really at institutional level. In 1993, the US adopted the Government Results and Performance Act. And the Government Results and Performance Act required all government agencies to put in place a results framework to measure the results of their programs. So the example I will give is United States Agency for International Development, the Overseas Development Program. But all agencies, including domestic programs, had to have results frameworks like this. And so USAID identified 6 strategic development goals. An example of this was one called Broad-Based Economic Growth and Agricultural Development. And for the strategic development goal, they identified a set of economic indicators, a set of outcome indicators at both country and global levels. So, for example, one of the indicators for measuring the strategic development goal of broad-based economic growth was annual average growth rates in real per capita income above 1%, being achieved in the recipients of US foreign assistance, countries like Egypt and India and so on. And so, in their performance reports, when they're reporting, well, how is USAID doing, they would have statements like this one, that in the second half of the 90s, 70% of countries receiving US foreign assistance grew at more than positive rates of growth compared to only 45% in the first half of the decade. So high rates of growth being achieved in countries receiving foreign assistance. And this is being presented as a measure of the results of US foreign assistance. This is outcome monitoring. You see what's happening to outcomes and you claim that's a result. But in their own results report, USAID said you can't actually reasonably attribute overall country progress to our programs. And more critically, the General Accounting Office of the United States had to assess the results performance of the various government agencies, wrote a letter back to USAID that basically said, do you think we're stupid? But the way they put it was a bit more polite. It was that the indicators are so broad, affected by so many indicators, they cannot realistically serve to measure the agency's performance. So outcome monitoring tells you what is happening, and that's important, but it doesn't tell you why it's happening. It doesn't tell you if your programs are responsible for the change in outcomes you see. Only rigorous impact evaluations can do that. And so if you're going to know your programs are making a difference, you have to adopt rigorous impact evaluations. And I'm going to come back to that theme again and again and again throughout this talk. But first, let's not throw away outcome monitoring. Outcome monitoring is important, and I'll show a couple of examples actually from developing countries which have done, some have done quite good jobs in this regard. Just to say, USAID abandoned the outcome monitoring. Back in 2002, USAID abandoned outcome monitoring. Many other agencies are still going down that road. But the first country to go down that road realised it's a mistake and stopped doing it. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't do monitoring, but we have to know the limitations of monitoring. So to give an example, actually I've got 2 examples from Africa here. So one is in Uganda, which twice a year publishes, it's called the Government Annual Performance Report, but they publish it twice a year. And an example would be this table here. For the health sector, there's a set of outcome indicators, and I've highlighted that for under 5 vitamin A dose, and you see that in 2015 it was 26%, and it gone a bit in 2015, the following year, 2016, but the target was 66%. So if you see these outcome data, you have to say, well, why aren't we doing what we're meant to be doing? Are the programs, why are we not achieving our target? Are the programs we're doing not working, or are we not doing good programs with insufficient coverage? So outcome monitoring leads you to ask questions. And the Government Annual Performance Report in Uganda is discussed twice a year at a cabinet retreat chaired by the Prime Minister or the President himself, calls together the various ministers to hold them to account to what appears in the GAPR. And you can do this lower down the causal chain, looking even at output measures. So an example, which is a real-life example, okay, you said you're going to rehabilitate 500 kilometres of road in this year. You spent all the money and you've done 100 kilometres. So, you know, what's going on? So you can hold government agencies to account using monitoring data. But it doesn't mean you can tell from this data whether their programs are successful or not. That requires impact evaluation. The second example comes from South Africa, which has a very well-established monitoring system for over a decade now. So you won't be able to read the details. But in this chart, the rows are different government agencies, mainly ministries, and the columns are different outcome domains. And they're ranked according to performance. So the one at the bottom, which is military services, does really badly. Red is bad. It's what's called a traffic light system. Some of Uganda use a traffic light system. So green is good, red is bad, and orange is in between. And actually grey in the Uganda system means no data, which is also bad. You should have data on what you're trying to measure. And so you can see, for example, this one, which is management diversity in the agencies, virtually no one's achieving it. So government using this dashboard can say, you guys really need to get your acts together, like higher education and training, need to get your acts together, you're not actually achieving very much across the board, and everyone needs to pay attention to management diversity. It's something clear the government as a whole is failing to get the action on that it wants to achieve. So outcome monitoring matters, but again, it does not tell you if you're making a difference. And that's what we're really here for. So do this, but know its limitations. So this is not results. To me, a result is, I've got a result, means I've achieved something. And outcome monitoring doesn't tell you that. To do that, we need rigorous impact evaluation using experimental, meaning randomized controlled trial designs, or valid non-experimental designs that have a comparison group constructed by some statistical means. And there's been slow recognition, but there is recognition, it's been slow, of the role of impact evaluation and evidence synthesis in informing policy debates about what works and what doesn't work. And I'll talk about some of the global experiences of that. And there remain challenges in using them in policy. So even agencies that have started to commission lots of studies actually haven't always thought through, well, how are we going to use those? The main exception is in health, where studies are being used in a very consistent, institutionalized way. So first of all, what constitutes high-quality evidence? For those that work in this area, you'll know the answer to what constitutes credible evidence is it depends. Because it depends on what question you're asking. So it's not true that randomized controlled trials are the answer to everything. There are many questions for which you actually want high-quality factual data. So suppose you want to know, is a program reaching its target population? So you're targeting young disadvantaged mothers of a particular program. Is this program reaching young disadvantaged mothers? Maybe it's not reaching the right age group. Maybe the mothers it's reaching are actually not that badly off. So is it reaching the right group? Well, to know that, you want to have factual quantitative data. I'm distinguishing here between factual data that tells you what happened and counterfactual data. Counterfactual data tell you what would have happened in the absence of an intervention. And that's how we do an impact evaluation. You don't need an impact evaluation to know about your targeting success. And it's an important policy question. And you would also like to have qualitative data telling you about the barriers and facilitators, about why groups are not taking part in the programs they're meant to take part in. So if the question is about participation in programs, factual analysis is enough. But if you want analysis of causal effects, did a program make a difference? Here's a program to actually improve the health outcomes or cognitive development of children born to young disadvantaged mothers. Does that program work? Then you need a counterfactual analysis of what would have happened to those children in the absence of that program. And that's where a randomized controlled trial or a quasi-experimental study comes in. And we have an evidence pyramid, it'll be familiar to some of you, and let's focus on the top of the pyramid, where basically randomized controlled trials tell us whether particular programs work, and then systematic reviews pull together the global evidence on whether these programs work or not. So if you're a policymaker coming into a new field, and I'll come back to this, say you want to get an employment program for unemployed youth from ethnic minority backgrounds. Before you start thinking what programs to implement, look at the global evidence base. What appears to have worked elsewhere? And as I'll say again and again, it doesn't mean it's a blueprint approach. It doesn't mean if there's a program that works in Chicago, take it to Catalonia. If it worked in Birmingham, do it in Barcelona. It means look at the evidence base and then think about applying and testing programs that have worked elsewhere. But you still need to test them here because what works in one context may not work in another context. And that's very important in social programs. So let's talk about, again, about credible evidence. And the example I will use is one that all of us can relate to, and it's about dietary practices. In many countries, including the UK, it's recommended that the healthy diet, and we will hear that Catalonia has the second highest life expectancy in the world, we're all very healthy. In many countries, the recommendation from government is people should eat 5 pieces of fresh fruit and vegetables a day. There was a study reported on the BBC in 2014 that said actually you should eat 7 pieces a day. That the recommended portions of 5 a day is not enough. Having 7 or more is actually better for you. 2 months later, the BBC carried another story that said you shouldn't eat more than 5 a day. There are no benefits. So here we have a clear case of contradictory scientific evidence. And the public are quite right to be sceptical of scientific evidence if it looks like this. If you can come out with 2 directly contradictory findings and apparently no way to actually tell which is right or not. But there is a way. There's a very clear way, and one of these is right and the other is wrong. They can't both be right. And actually we know which one is right and which one is wrong. Let's look at the underlying studies. So the 7-piece study has a nice graph, and it's published in a peer-reviewed journal. And this has a reference group of people that eat no fruit and vegetables at all whatsoever, never seen a tomato or lettuce in their lives. Yes? And you see that as you eat more, then there's a percentage decrease in the risk of death. So including 7 and more, you're less likely to die if you eat more fresh fruit and vegetables. The problem with this study is it's a correlation analysis of observational data. That means they've simply got hold of data on dietary practices and death rates and observed there's a positive correlation between eating more fruit and vegetables and being less likely to die, and that is a monotonic increase right up to 7 and beyond. But there's a problem here of what we call selection bias. Selection bias is when people who get the intervention, which is eating more fruit and vegetables, and those characteristics determining getting the intervention are correlated with the outcome of interest, not dying. And that's clearly true here. What do we know about people that eat 7 or more pieces of fruit and vegetables a day? They're not normal, okay? This is not normal behaviour. Right? These people spend their whole time eating fruit and vegetables and going to the gym. That's all they do. Okay? So they have certain health-seeking behaviours that make them more likely to live longer and make them more likely to eat fruit and vegetables. So there may be a causal relationship there, but you can't tell from this data. And more seriously, these people who eat more, they tend to be wealthier, better educated and so on, all of which are correlated with living longer and correlated with healthier diets. So you cannot tell from this observational data if there's a causal relationship here. So this study should have been in the news, and the headline should have been really rubbish research published in peer-reviewed journal. Okay? It shouldn't have been about the finding because the finding is just wrong. It's just misleading. You cannot establish a causal relationship from these data. The second study has also a nice graph which shows a hazard ratio of dying as you eat more fruit and vegetables. And the probability of dying declines the more fruit and vegetables you eat, but it plateaus at 5. So this study clearly supports very strongly the current government recommendation to have 5 a day. Beyond that, doesn't have any health benefits. This graph, comes from a systematic review. Again, based on observational data, because there aren't any randomized controlled trials of dietary practices, but they only include high-quality studies. So we have a lot of salt in these studies. You want a lot of salt in these studies, yes? Where you're saying that basically you don't include just observational studies that don't control for confounders. So the studies that are included take account of these other factors like education and wealth and so on to capture just the effect coming from dietary practices. So the point here is that correlation is not causation. So we don't want to take evidence from studies that mistake correlation for causation, like this one does. And systematic reviews pull together only high-quality evidence. Part of doing a systematic review is screening the quality of studies and throwing out the low-quality studies. So you only have valid studies of causal effects in the review. And we have lots of reviews in the Campbell Library of social and economic programs, and I'll come to some of them to show whether these programs work or not. So there has been a revolution in using evidence and producing evidence, particularly through randomized controlled trials, and the largest growth in randomized controlled trials has not come from health, where it's very well established, it's come from the private sector. The private sector uses randomized controlled trials all the time. You're probably exposed to a dozen randomized controlled trials a day and you don't know it. Every time you go to in a supermarket, you're being exposed to a randomized controlled trial about product placement, about product marketing, product labeling, and so on. Every time you open a direct mailing in your mail or in your email, you are being exposed to a randomized controlled trial about wording of the email and so on. Actually, if you received the Campbell newsletter, you're being exposed to a randomized controlled trial about the day on which we send it and the email title we use to see which increased the open rates. So randomized controlled trials are everywhere and you don't even know they're happening. So in the private sector, Amazon some years ago did a DVD price experiment where you could actually get up to a $15 difference in the same product. So you'd order a DVD, you'd click on a DVD to buy it, and you could be offered a price of $5 or $20 purely at random. It wasn't trying to work out your willingness to pay, it was simply randomly assigning you a different price. And they're trying to work out how much people were willing to pay for that DVD so they could maximize profits by charging the maximum possible price. In this particular case, it was found out, and people who paid more had to be reimbursed because it was deemed to be illegal. But there's still many examples with our experiments going on. So Yahoo, search engines like Yahoo make their money, well, Yahoo doesn't make money anymore, but it used to make money, by people clicking through to adverts on their homepage. And so if Yahoo thinks, oh, here's a new design of our homepage to maximize click-through rates, they don't convene working groups and subcommittees and so on to discuss it for hours and months on end. They simply take the new design, put it up on the homepage, and randomly assign 100,000 visitors, because I get millions of visitors an hour, 100,000 visitors to go to the redesigned site. And after 1 hour, they assess whether that makes a difference or not. So people often say impact evaluations take a long time. For Yahoo, an impact evaluation takes 1 hour. Okay? How long an impact evaluation takes depends on your theory of change about how long it takes to see the outcomes being observed. I mentioned we're doing randomized controlled trial of the day in which we send out our newsletter. It takes a week. RCTs don't need to take that long. The other interesting example from business, and particularly important for social programs. Because a lot of people say, oh, but social programs, there's a lot of heterogeneity. I don't know what that is in Spanish. Heterogeneity. Sorry? Yeah? Okay, like you said. A lot of heterogeneity, which means there are a lot of differences in context, in program design, program implementation, treatment populations, and so on. So you can't really learn from that. But actually, heterogeneity is the friend of learning, not its enemy, because you can see in which context, which populations things work and when they don't. And the good example of this is Cisco, the software company in the US, who became very successful for mergers and acquisitions. Now, this is surprising because 80% of mergers and acquisitions are bad for the bottom line. 80% of mergers and acquisitions lose money for the company acquiring the company and the company being acquired. But Cisco tripled its profits through a program of 60 mergers and acquisitions. How is that possible? Overall, mergers and acquisitions are a bad thing. The management of Cisco said 80% of mergers and acquisitions fail. That means 20% work. Let's identify the characteristics for 20% that work and let's do those. And that's what they did. But the thing is, so they exploit heterogeneity to find out which ones work, but they had a database of 9,000 cases to look at. And the problem in doing this sort of analysis in social programs is we have too few studies to really exploit heterogeneity, because so many social programs are being done which are not being evaluated. Not because we know they work, they've never been evaluated, but no one's testing to see whether they work or not. And I'll skip that bit. Impact evaluation is the bottom line for effective social programs. What do I mean? The fact is that the RCTs being done by the private sector show that most things don't work. Most things don't work. And in fact, because most things don't work, 80% of businesses fail in the first 5 years. It's a stylized fact from around the world. In most countries, you'll find 80% of businesses fail within the first 5 years. Do we really think that public social programs do any better? Is the public sector better at doing things than the private sector? No, but there's no bottom line for public programs. If a private company fails, it loses money, it goes out of business. If a public program fails, meaning it doesn't achieve a change in outcomes, we just don't know. And so we keep funding failing programs. The fact is, if you don't do impact evaluations, which is the bottom line for social programs, you don't know if they're working or not. Where this bottom line's been put in place, the failure rates are the same or higher than you get in the private sector. So the Institute of Education Sciences in the US undertook randomized controlled trials of 90 programs, and 90% of them, this education, 90% of education programs assessed had little or no effect. In employment and labour services, Department of Labour commissioned RCTs, with 75% of them found weak or no effects. Programs are not working. And back to the private sector, and these are old data, Google and Microsoft reviewed 13,000 RCTs they had done across different product types and marketing strategies. 89% found the innovations didn't work. Most things don't work. Most things make no difference. Okay, you can do this or do what you're already doing, and you'll find no difference. But there's no bottom line in social programs, so you can always shift the bottom line if you don't do rigorous impact evaluation. You always say, okay, we didn't mean to do that, we meant to do this. Or just do process evaluations that don't get at if the program's working or not. So it really matters that you have to do rigorous impact evaluations to assess if programs work or not. Most programs have not been subject to rigorous impact evaluations. There are many, where we have Campbell systematic reviews, we find many areas where programs don't work. This one's on teenage pregnancy, and there are different types of program, where the pale purple bar is the intervention group, treatment group mean, and the dark purple is the control group mean, and there's a confidence interval. So where they overlap, which in all cases but the last one, it means the program makes no difference to actual sexual practice, which is not shown here, or pregnancy rates. So interventions designed to reduce teenage pregnancy do not work. Curfews, which are very common in the US in particular, so children under a certain age are not allowed to be out of home after a certain hour to reduce crime rates and victimization rates. They don't work. No effect on crime or victimization. Harsh regimes such as boot camps or scared straight. So boot camps are just being very tough, subjecting young prisoners, juveniles, to military camp-style imprisonment, where they have to go through harsh exercise regimes. Scared straight is where you take children at risk of becoming criminals and expose them what prison life is like to deter them from becoming criminals. Scared straight is actually harmful. Children exposed to scared straight are more likely to become criminals than children not exposed to scared straight. So the program doesn't work, it's actually harmful. And indeed, prison is no more effective than non-custodial sentences. So if your goal is to reduce reoffending, actually not sending people to prison is at least as good at, if not better, than actually putting them in non-custodial sentences like community-based rehabilitation. And there are many branded programs, I won't go into a lot of detail about branded programs, like multisystemic therapy and nurse-family partnership in the UK, that are being promoted by their designers in the United States. These programs, when subject to rigorous, independent, systematic reviews, don't work. So there are lots and lots of things out there that are being done. We know they don't work. There are some things that do work. We have evidence from Campbell reviews. We have outside 14 plain language summaries translated into Spanish of Campbell reviews, so please do take those. What I'm going to discuss in the last section now of the talk are two issues. One is institutionalising the production and use of evidence, and the second is opportunities for coordination in production. So we heard talk already today about the need for better collaboration or alliances or coordination. We've heard already today that the health sector is the sector here in Catalonia, but also across the world, where production and use of evidence has become most institutionalised and being done most widely. And this is based largely on systematic reviews. So if we go to the global level, the World Health Organization has its manual on producing guidelines that give recommended practice in areas like deworming, malaria treatment, and so on. And what they say is the guidelines have to be informed by high-quality systematic reviews. So when WHO wants to revise its guidelines, it commissions systematic reviews to address those very specific points in the guidelines. To take an example, at the end of last year, they revised their guidelines on antiretroviral therapies for people living with HIV. And they raised the seroprevalence count, so made more people eligible to receive ART based on WHO guidelines. They commissioned a systematic review specifically on that point. What should be the seroprevalence threshold for being allowed to get ART treatment, so show it starts to be effective. And so very targeted systematic reviews around very specific policy or practice questions. And we don't see that degree of precision generally in other sectors. We don't see institutionalization. What we see in WHO goes down to the national level. I'll talk about the UK here, but it happens in many other countries, including Spain. So behind a lot of this is a group called the Cochrane Collaboration, which is the same as the Campbell, but in health. And actually, people from Cochrane, which came before Campbell, helped start Campbell some 17 years ago. So in the UK, you have the National Institutes of Health Research, and they fund 21 Cochrane groups, which are different groups that help produce reviews in areas like arthritis, treating blood diseases, and so on. And they also fund production reviews in these areas. And they also give incentive awards to accelerate reviews in areas they think are particularly important. So a lot of infrastructure support from government, a lot of money from government going to supporting production of the evidence base. And that evidence base then gets used by the National Institute, NICE, National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence. NICE produces guidelines on policy and practice for health, and actually other sectors as well. So they have a recent one on guidelines for teachers to spot children at risk of potentially being abused in the home. So the number of areas they operate in. But also they're key in determining how National Health Service resources can be spent. So in the UK you have health services free at point of use for a very wide range of treatments. But it's NICE guidelines determine what actually is eligible for NHS support based on systematic review evidence and cost effectiveness analysis evidence. Hardly a week goes by when NICE is not being criticised in the press for letting grandmothers die, for denying some expenditure to be allowed on the NHS. But this is based on a very systematic review of the evidence of what the most cost-effective interventions are. So the use of evidence in the health sector has been strongly institutionalised through systematic reviews, guideline productions, resource allocation decisions based on systematic reviews. You don't see that in other sectors on a scale like this. But there are exceptions. I'll talk about 4 different country models. The first one is the UK. In the last 10 years now, a bit less, the UK has established the What Works network. So NICE has become one of the What Works centres, but the others are all more recent than that. The biggest, they're funded by government and big lottery, so not only government funded, and they commission systematic reviews, and the largest ones also commission primary studies, randomised controlled trials. So they cover areas like well-being, crime reduction, ageing, local economic growth, and then they have regional centres for Scotland and Wales. It's not shown there. Okay, the largest one is the Education Endowment Foundation. This is the What Works Centre for Education in England. And they have funded now over 500 trials in primary schools, including nearly a third of all primary schools randomised controlled trials around teaching practice, school management and so on. If you'd gone back 10 years, teachers, teaching unions, school managers in the UK would have told you you can't do randomised controlled trials in the English education system. It's very decentralised, a lot of autonomy at school level. It's not possible to do RCTs in English education. Nearly a third of all primary schools are now involved in RCTs run by EF. There's been a fundamental culture shift in participating with generation of evidence of what works. They have an evidence portal, I'll show that in a moment, and a study by the National Audit Office in the UK showed that school managers are using this toolkit. In 2012, a third of school managers were using the toolkit. By 2015, nearly two-thirds of school managers were using the toolkit. So you have evidence being produced by this agency, putting on an evidence portal, which is here, I'll explain in a moment, and two-thirds of school managers, of intended users, are using this. That's an enormous success rate. If I can produce a Campbell review that 10% of intended users use, I'd be very happy. They've got two-thirds of intended users using this. And there's a couple of reasons. One is, this is really nice, okay? This really is very nice. So this is an evidence portal, which means the evidence they get from their reviews has been heavily brokered or translated or curated into a form that's very usable by the intended end users. They don't have to read a thick report like this on every single intervention. They can go to the evidence portal, and what it tells you is, okay, I want to improve learning outcomes for my students. And this column here tells you the impact in terms of additional months learning if you do this program. So these are very effective. Get 6 months additional learning from doing this program. Some have 0 here. They have no impact. So you can see a high impact program. This tells you the quality of the evidence. So strong evidence, not so strong evidence. And this tells you the cost. Not literally £5, but £5 symbols represents a high cost and a £1 symbol represents a low cost. So these are and there's 30-odd different approaches in the toolkit right now. So this is a low-cost, high-impact approach with strong evidence. So you would pick that. The second factor is that school managers in the UK have their own budget to spend from something called the pupil premium. And it's up to them to decide how to spend it. But what the government directive is, it says spend this money in an evidence-informed way to increase learning outcomes. So I'm a school manager, I've got money to spend in an evidence-informed way to increase learning outcomes. How am I going to find out where that is? Here. This tells me exactly that. And I can click on this, and it can get me, I can click on this and get more details about the programme. And I can click down and get the original studies that talk about the programme and its impact. So this is an extremely effective tool for guiding users towards using the evidence. You can't expect, see again, health is different. In health, doctors, health workers read medical journals. So they read systematic reviews. Teachers, school managers don't read education journals. They're not written in the same way, not in the same accessible way. So you have to translate or broker that knowledge to them in a way they can use it. Most policymakers will not receive or use evidence where you use passive dissemination of publishing in journals or on websites and so on. You've got to find active dissemination methods, active engagement with policy and practice stakeholders to find out ways of ensuring evidence is used. The Nordic model in Norway and Sweden and Denmark, you have government-funded research centres. And these government-funded research centres produce systematic reviews. It's their job. Okay? You have people whose job it is to write systematic reviews of social programmes. So they go to work every day and they do these reviews. The example is Knowledge Centre for Health Services in Oslo, which includes also social welfare, SFI in Denmark and Copenhagen, SBU in Stockholm, which does HTA, but also does social welfare since 2015. And all of these have priorities agreed from an annual consultation exercise. So it's not like a commissioned review by review. The staff are there permanently doing systematic reviews for government departments, but then they meet with them twice a year to agree what are your priorities in the coming half year. We'll start doing reviews on those topics. Let's take an example. So Knowledge Centre for Education in Norway, it's not listed here, ask the ministry, what's your priority? they say, oh, we're very concerned about school dropouts, children leaving school early before they should be complete, before they get to 18. So what the Knowledge Centre did was there's an existing Campbell review on dropouts. They took the Campbell review, they updated it with any new studies that were out there. Then they went back to the ministry and said, well, look, there's these there's 6 different interventions that appear effective in reducing dropouts. So the ministry looked at them and said, well, there are 3 here of these 6 that look like they might be implementable in Norway. Let's try them out using randomised controlled trials. So again, it's not a blueprint approach. You look what works elsewhere. It works in Ontario, let's try it in Oslo. Okay, you don't just adopt it like a blueprint. You try it out using new randomised control trials, which are still ongoing in county level across Norway. SBU does an interesting thing called scientific uncertainties, where they identify scientific gaps where there's no knowledge, we don't know what's effective, and then commission research to fill those gaps. Here's an important gap relevant for policymakers in Sweden. Let's commission research to fill that policy gap. The Nordic model is an example then of this evidence-driven project cycle. You want to be using evidence all the way around the project cycle. So when you're doing new programs, you consult with the evidence base of reviews to see what programs to try out. Do formative testing in local context, pilot programs for efficacy, go to scale effectiveness, try out in different contexts, then synthesize the evidence globally, and then goes round again. Always is iterative with feedback loops, all the way around, iterative process. Finally, the US model, there's 2 US models. One is based on evidence portals, like the What Works Clearinghouse in education. They're also clearinghouses in criminal justice and employment and child welfare. And the other Results for America runs a Moneyball for Government program. In the Moneyball for Government program, they have what they call results-based programs, evidence-based programs that are shown to have worked. But there's 2 problems there, like Head Start and Nurse Van Partnership. There are 2 problems. They base it on single studies. You should not base policy advice on single studies. You should base policy advice on systematic reviews. And the second is conflict of interest, because much of what they recommend are branded programs. So they've been invented by a particular research group and then promotes the program. And that same research group undertakes evaluations of the program that they've designed. So there's conflict of interest there. Finally, in Latin America, there are many centralized evaluation agencies in Latin American countries. The best known is CONIVAL in Mexico. There's like Synergia in Colombia and so on. These are established in law. They are like 2003, the Mexican evaluation law. And their function is to ensure the quality of the evaluation of social programs. For social programs to be funded in Mexico, they have to have a monitoring evaluation framework approved by CONIVAL. And they have to have periodic impact evaluations of their programs. This is very advanced. You will not get government money for social programs unless you take a CONIVAL-approved impact evaluation every 3 years or so. And they have a traffic light system, green, red, and orange, which rates the quality of the M&E systems of those agencies. So you're not penalised for failing programs, you're penalised for not actually assessing your programs are doing well or failing. So the traffic light system is actually around making sure agencies are testing whether their programs are effective or not. So here are the different models I've talked about. I won't go through in detail because I have discussed them, but they have different aspects. And I'll first talk about the bottom row. The most important thing is how is it the evidence is being used. So in the Nordic model, it's closely integrated decision-making. It's very heavy, it's institutionalised. They do reviews that there's a clear demand for from policymakers. That's not true in the What Works Centre in the UK. Each one is different, has to find its own pathway to policy influence. The US model, the portals are like standalone. They hope people use them. Whereas the Results for America is advocacy-based. They go out and tell people to use evidence. And finally, Latin American model promotes systemically rigorous monitoring and evaluation. So different approaches that you can think about using. So finally, just one slide, there's many things going on, so really there should be lots of opportunity to coordinate and work together. So different agencies working in this space can coordinate in various ways. You have common standards and guidelines. So what constitutes high quality evidence? You have common standards across your agencies to agree on what constitutes high quality evidence. You can share, synchronize, or integrate your work plans. So you can at least share your work plans so you know what the other agency is going to do, but you can actually synchronize them so you do things in parallel or don't duplicate each other's work, or you actually integrate, so you actually have like a common work plan. You can do common evaluations or joint evaluations. So you all work together evaluating the same program using the same framework, so you can synthesize those evaluation findings. You can of course share findings, but you can also have joint support to evidence synthesis. So if you've got programs that are nationally or regionally or globally relevant, you can coordinate the demand for reviews. What we see, and I'll come back to it, is many agencies commissioning reviews of the same topic. They're looking for the same global evidence base, so it's just duplication and waste. However, this doesn't happen. This seems like all very obvious things you would do. Doesn't happen in practice. The What Works centres in the UK all have their own evidence standards. So there's a group called Nesta that tried to work from the evidence standards and get a common set of standards. Didn't happen. They all have their own evidence standards. Nesta's trying again to get them to get a common set of standards, but I doubt they'll succeed, to be honest. There are exceptions. So in my own world of international development, Development Assistance Committee has evaluation criteria that are accepted by all development agencies. And of course, WHO does international guidelines that are adopted often into national guidelines, but there are exceptions. Work plans don't get synchronized because of timing issues. People say, oh, well, your timing doesn't fit my timing, or because of national mandate or regional mandate. We have our mandate, you have a different mandate, we're going to do our own work plan. We're not going to coordinate with you because timing won't allow it. Common evaluations. One of my first ever job back in the early 90s was an evaluation in Tanzania done for the Swedish and Norwegian governments. It was meant to be a joint evaluation. And it fell apart because the different development agencies, Institut and NORAD, could not agree on the terms of reference. And if Sweden and Norway can't cooperate, who can, really, to be honest? Because they're two of the most similar countries you're going to get in Europe. And then, basically, agencies like their own cover on a report. This is bizarre. It's very nice if you're a consultant, because you just do the same report several times with a different cover on it. Basically, agencies trust evidence with their own report, their own cover on it, and don't trust evidence from other sources. And so they don't like doing joint studies. And then generally, there's a failure to support global public goods. And this really is a shame. So Cochrane has achieved this. Cochrane is a system for producing global evidence through reviews and what works that's used internationally through WHO and in many different countries. We've not managed the same thing in Campbell. We're trying to. We've established global pooled funds in child welfare and children at risk to get countries commissioning reviews in these areas to pool their money, like it's done in Cochrane, to commission reviews jointly rather than separately commissioning the same review and over again, but it's not currently taken off. So there are many opportunities. Properties and monitoring data. Most agencies collect monitoring data that don't get used. So monitoring data should be used. I've said that there's a good role for monitoring data. Collect them and use them. Use systematic reviews. Systematic reviews are there. They're in the Campbell Library. We're trying to promote them. If you're going to do a program on teenage pregnancy, on curfews, on mindfulness, look what the Campbell Library says for evidence on what works and what doesn't work. You've got to test programs. Never do a new program without putting in place an evaluation of that program. That's a missed opportunity to actually test what works, and actually it's a missed opportunity to really improve lives, because you could be doing a new program that doesn't work and not testing if it works or not. But existing programs untested, you need to test those too. And then coordination. As we just saw, there are many opportunities for coordination. They're not being realised. Actually, I didn't put joint events. Here's a joint event, so you're doing a good job coordinating on joint events. But they are the easiest form of coordination. It's a thing you can normally do. But these missed opportunities are opportunities. So if you really want to make a difference, then make sure you do these things to generate and use better evidence, and so lead to better lives of the people we're trying to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. Una xerrada molt interessant. No he volgut tallar més i ens queda molt poc temps, però ens queda temps per una o dues preguntes. Si algú vol concretar algun tema sobre la xerrada del senyor White. I would ask you a question then.
Okay.
Because I'm interested in knowing to what extent you think that the use of administrative data can help to generate evidence through this kind of experiments and counterfactual data.
So certainly it can, and again it's an opportunity. There are many cases in which administrator can be used for doing rigorous studies, and there are examples when it's being done, particularly where you get, so I just think one example comes off my head, if you're doing things like in public utilities, measures to conserve energy or conserve water use. There's an important issue here. And so because you have administrative data from billing and billing measuring water use, then you can easily do different messaging campaigns through the billing system to households and see which are most effective, and that's all based on administrative data. It's very low cost. So people say impact evaluation is very expensive. You administrative data and they're not low cost. So there are many opportunities, I think, for doing that. If you're collecting data, you know, unemployment records and so on, again, down at local level, you can use the registers to identify target groups and interventions, and you get the unemployment records through the administrative data again. So there's lots of stuff you can do that's not being done that reduces cost and, I think, timeliness as well of the studies.
Okay, thank you. Alguna altra pregunta? Potser allà baix?
Sí. Hola, mira, voldria preguntar-te, Howard, gràcies per la xerrada. Per una banda, que una de les tensions que hem vist a la pràctica, els que una mica intentem introduir l'evidència, és que per una banda el temps pel qual doncs, els polítics necessiten l'evidència és inversament proporcional al temps necessari per produir una revisió sistemàtica. Per la teva experiència i llarga trajectòria, una mica com pots o com es pot superar aquesta dificultat a la pràctica. Nosaltres necessitem evidència, tardarem 6 mesos, un any. No, però és que el polític ens diu no, és que la necessitava ja per ahir, l'evidència. Com una mica es resol aquesta contradicció a la pràctica? Gràcies.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So the ideal answer is twofold. One is actually the urgency is not as great as the policymaker thinks it is, because actually most problems they're addressing, it's not going anywhere anytime quickly. Yes, it's still going to be around next year, in 5 years. So you need to get the evidence in place, and it makes more sense to do a high-quality systematic review of available evidence than to do a low-quality rapid review that can give misleading and biased evidence. But policymakers need to be educated in that. Second is, because these problems won't go away, and there are policy fads where different policies come in and out of favour, so they'll want to know evidence in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time when that policy becomes topical again. There's a good reason for building up a comprehensive library, a global library, of what works and what doesn't work, which is what the Campbell Library is meant to be. So when the question comes next time, you can just say, I'll look in the Campbell Library, I'll see what the answer is. So the Cochrane Library has that. The Cochrane Library has 7,000 reviews. So if you have any personal medical issue, you will have noticed I have some problems with my knees, I just look in the Cochrane Library, what's the evidence on this or that intervention? And I can find out, oh, this doesn't work, this does work, so I should do this, I shouldn't do that. We'd like to be in the same place with social programmes. So the Minister says, we've got a growing problem of opioid drug use, what have been effective interventions? We actually do have some reviews on this. Go to the Campbell Library, see what programmes have been effective elsewhere, recommend them for trying out here. So building up the Campbell Library as a long-term investment is the best way to actually be able to answer this question. In the short run, when we're not there, then I do think you have to say, well, we'll look at the available evidence very quickly, and if you can't do a full systematic review, you can do at least some sort of scoping, where you say, well, actually, there's no evidence on this programme, or there's 3 or 4 studies, and here's what they say. And you can do that in 2 to 3 months. If a policymaker wants something in 2 to 3 hours, then, which is more likely, then if you haven't got an existing review available, then actually there's not a lot you can do, to be honest. And you've got to, I believe, really take the long game, which involves working with policymakers, what I heard you're doing, to educate them on what constitutes good quality evidence and then why it takes time to produce it, but invest in building knowledge so we won't have this problem and this question coming up every time in 5 years' time.
Okay. Thank you. We take note of that. De fet, estem ja treballant en aquesta direcció, però hem de reforçar. Thank you very much, Mr. White. We don't want to go out of time, so per no allargar i per no perdre el ritme, I will hand